Hello students, welcome to LODLC lecture series on MKC 309 Management Theory, Study Section 7. The title of today's topic is Neoclassic Theory. Introduction. In the early section of this course, you will remember that you were introduced to the historical development of management theory. The areas broadly covered in this section are the pre-classic contributors, classical theories, etc. In this study section, you will learn about the neoclassic theory. Like the classic theory, the neoclassic theory is made up of different streams: early behaviorist, Alton studies, human relations, and behavioral science approach. Outline of study section 7. When you have studied this section, you should be able to 1. Explain the development, causes, and elements of neoclassic theory. Explain the contributions of early behaviorists to the neoclassic theory. 3. Discuss the Alton studies, its findings and implications of the studies. And 4. Discuss the criticism of neoclassic theory. Development of neoclassic theory. Neoclassic theory is an economic theory that outlines how a steady economic growth rate will be accomplished with the proper amount of the three driving forces, which are labor, capital, and technology. As the name suggests, neoclassic theory was built on the base of classical theory. The theory states that by varying the amount of labor and capital in the production function, an equilibrium state can be accomplished. When a new technology becomes available, the labor and capital needs to be adjusted to maintain growth equilibrium. Development of classical theory. Development of neoclassical theory. Neoclassical theory modified, added to, and in some ways extended classical theory. The basic assumption of neoclassical theory is that the psychological and social aspects of the worker as an individual and his work group output be emphasized. Classical theory focuses on structure, order, the formal organization, economic factor, and the objective reality. Neoclassical theory, in contrast, focused on social factors at work or the informal organization and emotions. Although neoclassical theory has evolved over several centuries, there was no intensive development of the mainstream until the late 1920s and the early 1930s. Neoclassical theory was caused by several political, economic, and social factors, such as the flow of workers from farming to factories, excesses of early factory owners, and the rise of the labor movement. Technological change and professionalization of management led to the emergence of neoclassic management. Elements of neoclassic theory. The two major elements of neoclassic theory are the individual, 2. The work group or informal group. Explaining these elements one after the other, starting with the individual. The differences among individuals that were ignored by the classical theory form the main thrust of neoclassic theory. This point will be further explained under the human relation theory. Then the second element of neoclassic theory, which is the work group or informal organization, is the emphasis upon the informal groups. The work group or informal organization within the structure of the formal organization is discussed here. Rather than focus on the economic side, neoclassical theory focuses on the social aspect of men, whose overriding need is seen as a desire to belong, to be accepted by, and start well in his work group. Contributions of early behaviorists to the neoclassic theory. The behavioral theories focus on people to determine the best way to manage in all organizations. In the 1920s, management writers started to questioned the classical approach to management and changed their focus from the job itself to the people who perform the job. Like the classical theorists, behavioral theorists were looking for the best way to manage in all organizations. You can observe that the behavioral approach to management stressed the need for human skills. Contribution of Argo Mustaberg. Argo Mustaberg, a German psychologist, pioneered the field of industrial psychology. In his book Psychology and Industrial Efficiency, published in 1913, Mustaberg discussed how psychologists could help industry in three major ways. 1. Psychologists could study jobs and find ways of identifying the individuals who's best suited to the job. 2. Psychologists could help in identifying the psychological condition under which individuals are likely to do their work best. 3. Psychologists could develop strategies that would influence employees to behave in ways that are compatible with management interests. Mustaberg is referred to as the father of industrial psychology because he did not start work in this area. His ideas, the examples he provided, ignited the imagination of others and led to the establishment of the field of industrial psychology. Contribution of Mary Parker Follett. Follett is another early behaviorist who focused on group dynamics. The argument is that members of organizations are continually influenced by the groups within which they operate. She argued that groups have the capacity to exercise control over themselves and their own activities. Follett also believed that organizations should operate on the principle of power with rather than power over. She argued that power should be jointly developed cooperative concept based on hierarchy pressure. Follett's method of operating the power with concept is done by resolving conflicts through integration. Integration is the process of finding solutions that will satisfy both parties. She placed much emphasis on achieving what they called integration unity, whereby the organization would operate as functional or with the various interrelated parts working together effectively to achieve organizational goals. Alton Studies. Alton Studies, sponsored by the National Research Council, which began in 1924 in the Alton Works of the Western Electric Company in Cicero, Illinois, near Chicago, thereby generating the name Alton. The primary aim of these studies was to examine working conditions as they are related to output and generally to classify the numerous problems arising in the working situation. To adequately understand the Alton study, there are two things you need to know. 1. The prevailing intellectual and social context in which Mayo and his colleagues worked. 2. The pre-Alton studies. Explaining these two contexts one after the other, starting with the prevailing intellectual and social context. The prevailing social context include the culture of individualism and utilitarianism. The individualistic ideology generally stresses the preeminence of the individual over the social conditions of systems which take into account collective and solidaristic aspects of society, as in the feudal and the guild system. Individualism implies both reliance on individual effort and free contract. The trust of individualism is that man is naturally carried away by his own self-interest and utility, while society is just the sum of its individual members. Then a second prevailing ideology which was also gaining ground during Mayo's time was the scientific management of Taylor and his associates. Taylor and his scientific management advocated purposive planning as well as good incentive methods should be adopted. The scientific management was influenced by individualism and utilitarianism to neglect to the neglect of the social emergencies of men and the existence of the higher spring of social behavior. Then the pre-Houghton studies. Two studies preceded the Houghton studies: the Philadelphia spinning mill and the illumination experiment. Explaining the Philadelphia spinning mill, the objective of this study was to inquire into the causes of the absenteeism and low morale among the section of the spinning mill workers. 40 men were involved in these studies. Due to high labor turnover, incentives were introduced, yet productivity remained low, while absenteeism and similar symptoms of poor organizational health were high. Mayo was called to inquire and make recommendations to improve productivity and reduce labor turnover. Mayo introduces rest pauses, and production increased from 70% to between 80 and 82%, but production fell when rest pauses were dropped. The second studies under pre-Houghton studies is the illumination experiment. This is the second pre-Houghton studies. These experiments were carried out to find the correlation light and output. The studies were conducted by G.A. Pennock, an engineer with the company. The two groups of workers in the experimental group and the control group were involved in the study. In the experimental group, illumination was increased, while in the control group, the light was left constant. At first, production increased on the experimental group, but with the passage of time, productivity also increased in the control group. Illuminating was then reduced in the experimental group, but output rose instead of going down. At the end of the day, the experiments failed to establish any correlation between light and productivity. The Houghton studies. The researchers refused to accept defeat for the confusing results obtained from the Philadelphia spinning mill and illumination experiments. Three other experiments known as the Houghton studies were carried out. These were 1. The relay assembly test room, the bank wiring test room, and the interview program. Explaining these Houghton experiments one after the other, starting with the relay assembly test room. This experiment was organized to study the correlation between physiological experimental factors, effect of fatigue, rest, pauses, shorter working days, and productivity. 5 women were selected from this study with their consent, and the conditions of the work were stated as 1. Altered rest pauses, 2. Shorter working days, 3. Shorter working weeks, and lastly, food and coffee breaks. Productivity rose without any clear connection to the physical factors being varied in the experiment. This clearly explains that there is every possibility that employees treated in a special way will improve their performance because of the attention, a theory known as the Houghton effect. The Houghton effect is the possibility that individuals singled out for a study may improve their performance simply because of the added attention they receive from the researchers rather than because of the specific factors being tested. Then the next one under Houghton experiment is the bank wiring test room. This study was to develop the new methods to obtain more exact information about special social people within the company. The researchers studied the group behavior that's developed among male employees who wired, soldered, and inspected switchboard equipment. The group was isolated in a workroom, and a researcher sat passively observing their activities during the day. The study showed that the group developed its own informal notion of acceptable productivity and used the good pressure to ensure compliance. Then the next Houghton experiment is the interview program. The experiments here were carried out in order to gather more information and check the results already obtained. Respondents were asked to state the factors that were satisfying and those that were dissatisfying on their jobs. Researchers found that behavior is not a matter of stimulus and response, but between the two, there are the complexities of human personalities which modify behavior. Criticism of neoclassic experiment. Criticism of neoclassic theory. The Orton studies have been severely criticized for one reason. The initial phase of the studies was a failure. The assumption that there would be a relationship between worker performance and workplace remuneration did not come to pass. You can also observe that some of the studies failed. For instance, workers did not respond in the expected and rational ways. Instead, their behavior appeared irrational, at least to the engineer's standard of rationality. Some critics even say that the findings were not obvious but were not entirely new, as they were already known before in the work of earlier scholars like Coley, Mead, among others, concerning the structures and influence of the former groups. Impact of Orton studies. The findings of Orton studies, the focus of management altered significantly. For instance, as against the impersonality that characterized the classical approach, the studies pointed to the impact that social aspects of the job had on productivity, particularly the effects of personal attention from supervisors and relationships among group members. Assessment of Orton studies. The findings of the studies shows that each individual brings to the job situation certain attitudes, beliefs, and way of life, as well as certain skills, technical, social, and logical. So, Orton studies were thus significant because they signaled the importance of interpersonal and group relationships within an organization. The Orton studies, as it can be observed, is significant also because it showed that informal work groups, the social environment of employees, have positive influence on productivity. Thank you for listening. We have come to the end of today's lecture. Hope to see you in the next class.